Okay, hi Dan. Thanks for agreeing to do this interview with me on group supervision. And what I wanted to do was to sort of introduce you and to invite you to say something about your background. And maybe also following that, we might do something about our stories of groups, for ourselves, what our early experience of groups were just to kind of just lend a bit of background context to this discussion on group supervision. How does that sound, Dan?
Yeah, that sounds like a really good idea.
Okay, so tell me a bit about yourself and your work, and also your sort of just start with that.
Well, professionally, I originally actually trained as a pure mathematician. And for many years, I thought that's what I wanted to do when I sort of finished studying. But during my PhD, I decided I wanted to go in a completely different direction. I knew at that point that that would be some form of psychodynamic therapy. But the big thing that's really relevant for what we're talking about today is I didn't know at that point that it was going to involve groups. So after I left university, I went and spent about 3 years working in the prison service, which runs a lot of groups. And in the second prison I worked in, I started working on a therapeutic community. And that was particularly, I think, my route in to thinking about groups and particularly therapeutic communities. So that's what I've done for the last 18 years now. Mainly, I work in therapeutic communities for children and adolescents who've been traumatized. Whilst I've been doing that, I also trained as a group analyst. So I do some other things as well, which involve groups. But so much of it for me comes back to that intersection between groups and therapeutic communities.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because also I'm just thinking about that transition that you made from being a mathematician to sort of working with, well, as you say, it was psychodynamic therapy to start with. There was something that teased you out of the maths world and into the psychotherapeutic world. And I'm just wondering kind of what that was, just listening to you, because they're so different.
They are, and it's hard really to know which level to answer it at because I guess there's so many different levels to it. But I suppose one which is kind of closer to the surface was a realization that I was much more interested in, for example, the teaching that I was doing. So whilst I was doing my PhD, I was also teaching undergraduates, and that actually the teaching and the involvement and the seminars and the lectures and the individual work I was doing with people, obviously about maths, not personal development, but actually that really inspired me more than my own research. And obviously to carry on in that direction, my focus would have had to be my own research. But that wasn't really what was bringing me pleasure. What was bringing me pleasure was working with people, people who are only a few years younger than me, but seeing them develop. So I think that was a large factor in it for me, that I can more consciously identify. Of course, there will have been other, more unconscious determinants that played a part as well.
Sure. And do you miss maths now? Do you miss maths?
I still think about maths quite a lot. I mean, I think in one way, and this wasn't consciously in the trajectory more moving towards groups, but I actually think that there's quite a lot of space for mathematical thinking in group dynamics, in network theory, probably much more than there would have been in individual work. So I think that probably has played a part. That there's a bit of my yearning for maths that I do still manage to touch on. I often keep it to myself because I don't quite know how to share it with other people, and I worry they'll misunderstand it. Because a lot of people think that maths is just about number and particularly about measuring things, and I'm not particularly into measuring things. I'm not really into quantitative methods or things like that. So I often don't share this with people, but there's something a bit deeper, I think, about dynamics that I think my mathematical background has actually helped me with.
Right. Yeah, and interesting there that you say that you wouldn't sort of naturally choose to share it with people because
Mm.
you kind of feel that you wouldn't be understood, which I
Mm.
understand myself, kind of sort of maths beyond
Mm.
very basic level is so I kind of think, yeah, you've got a point, and yet it feels a shame not to be able to sort of share that. But let's move on to groups and themselves. And I mean, the other thing that I thought might be useful was to people to understand perhaps both our early experiences of groups. For example, I was brought up in a family of 6. I had 3 sisters. We were born in quite close succession, 7 years between us. And within that, there was quite a lot of rivalry. And sort of scrapping, for various things. And then as a contrast to that, my father was also an invalid, if you like, in a certain way. He had a heart condition, which we all had to monitor. So my mother trained us to be like little nurses, really, to sort of monitor Dad as well. So in the times when he was having his heart attacks, we all just cohesed like that. And it was, complete cooperation. But then the other times, the contrast was, a lot of the time we were scrapping and there was no cooperation between us, So I had those 2 sort of different experiences being in the same group in my early life. So I thought that might be, worth sharing when we talk about some questions about rivalry and collusion in later on sort of thing. How about yourself?
I think I had, and it's hard to pin down exactly where it came from, but I think I had for a long time a very negative view of groups. I'm not sure that this is unusual actually for people who become group analysts, but I saw groups in quite a negative light. Not so much in terms of the really kind of perverse and toxic things like scapegoating, but for a long time I found it hard to see anything other than just a hindrance that groups are. That I can't quite remember. There's some sort of slightly wry joke, isn't there? That a camel is a horse designed by committee. That idea that
Yeah.
whatever a group produces is probably going to be worse than what the individuals might produce. And that the most intelligent person in the group is going to be brought down by the group and so on. This idea there might be something, the whole might be greater than the sum of its parts. I think I started from that assumption that the whole's going to be worse than the sum of its parts, really.
Right.
And I think, that probably fits with my initial trajectory in maths, that maths, I think, still a lot of mathematicians still think in that kind of, Renaissance Enlightenment way about, the individual genius like Newton or Einstein who's kind of forging a path despite what other people might think, this idea that collaboration might actually be beneficial rather than something that people sometimes make you do against your will. So I came with quite a negative view, and I think my mind was really opened when I started to work in the prison service, ironically, with some really challenging men and challenging behaviors, but thinking about actually what it might mean if you really could harness the power of the group, that wasn't always just a force for negativity, that something really beautiful might come out of it.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? And again, I guess that is the mathematician, because I think some research sort of indicates that, in nearly every case, 2 people perform better than one, like in, I don't know, if you dropped on a desert island or something, that 2 heads are better than one. So fascinating contrast, really, but does fit with that kind of the scientist kind of notion, really, doesn't it? So, okay, well, let's move into the main interview then. So what I wanted to then ask you was the next question, which is, what do you see as being the difference between group supervision and supervision in a group?
Well, maybe this is a little bit like what I was just saying about maths, that there's always a part of me is a bit worried still about being misunderstood, and groups are really powerful tools for misunderstanding and also for elucidating understanding. But I suppose one of the things I think is that I have my own thoughts on what group supervision is, and yet so often the way I hear it described is is so different that I sometimes feel I'm swimming against the tide, and I just have to accept the way that it might generally be used. So generally, I think group supervision is just kind of used for whenever you have a group of supervisees coming together in a group with a supervisor. That's how it's often used. But for me, that fits much more with this idea of supervision in a group. There is a group, there is some supervision going on in that group. So I would say that's the entry level approach to supervising in a group. And there are advantages to that, of course, because you can maybe support more supervisees at the same time, particularly if you've got a group maybe of trainees who are all at a similar stage, if they're all making their initial steps with providing therapy, then there'll be a lot of similar issues maybe. So in that kind of case, people might be able to learn from each other. But often the real focus there isn't on anything kind of lateral. There's just this relationship between the supervisor and the supervisee, and different supervisees present at different times. So where the spotlight is in the group kind of changes as time goes on, but primarily it's about that dyad, and that just kind of moves around the group. Whereas group supervision, I would see as something really quite different. And to explain the way I would think about it, what I would start with is saying that for me, the modern approach to psychodynamics really has this fundamental idea that our most important tool is ourselves. However we phrase it, countertransference classically, but that is our most important tool, whether you're working individually or in a group. The practitioners who are the supervisees, whether they're doing individual work or group work, or they might even be doing different approaches within the group. But fundamentally, what we're thinking about is, how do you make use of your countertransference? And I think one of the things that's really powerful about harnessing that power of the group, so for proper group supervision, is the idea that in some way the group itself becomes an instrument for increasingly sensitively calibrating that personal tool that we then take into the consulting room with ourselves. So that not only have you got, the inner world of the therapist and the inner world and the supervisor, you've got all of these other inner worlds of individuals, but even something collective, some sort of almost collective consciousness. So to give an example, I guess, there are many times when I've been supervising groups where someone's presented something, and then my response is normally to open it up to the rest of the group before I say something. And what often happens is that different members of the group, and it doesn't have to be the people who are most experienced or most qualified or anything like that, but different people will resonate with different aspects of the narrative. And so bits of potential countertransference that are like out there in the ether that the client has managed to convey to the therapist, and yet the therapist hasn't picked up on that. So the therapist has picked up on maybe one countertransferential response, but somehow through them, other aspects have now been picked up in the group. And I suppose particularly in terms of what I'm saying, it's not just that we've now got 6 individuals instead of 2, but that actually there might even be interrelationships now that start to emerge between those people who've picked up different fragments. And I think the ability to sort of explore that and try and reintegrate that is really powerful, because over time, what that's helping each of the supervisees do, I think, is to internalize an image of the group. I don't want them to internalize an image of me. I know that Patrick Casement, for example, talks about the idea of the internal supervisor. But what I want when I'm supervising a group is for them to have an internal supervision group rather than an internal supervisor, so that they're carrying that with them, so that when they meet with that same client again or different clients, they'll be able to pick up, resonances that for them they wouldn't have necessarily picked up before. But by having in mind, it's almost like, well, if Sandra was here, what would Sandra think about what that client has just said? And then would Sandra and I then end up having that argument that we always have in supervision about what the client's just said, and all of that. And I think that just, compared to the pie idea, the idea you've got a pie, the pie is an hour and a half, and we're going to share it out all out and try and give everyone as fair a piece of pie as possible. But still, everyone's only going to get 20 minutes or whatever. But no, instead, this idea that everyone's engaged at all moments because they're part of this wider instrument, I think it's a wonderful idea. Again, if you can find a way to harness it in the group.
Yes. No, and that reminds me actually of my first supervisor, who was Tavistock trained actually, and he used to, and I remember being quite puzzled at the start, and took me a while to sort of get it. But and he'd go around the group and asking how did other people feel about, say, the client that was being presented or something about the situation, and he'd really tease it out from us, what the feelings were, including the sort of ostensibly negative fantasies and so on. And the group, learned to work like that over time, and really share what was and it became like an instrument, as you say. So I think that was very beneficial, but also that implies a certain amount of skill on behalf of the facilitator, doesn't it? The group supervisor there.
I think it does, because so often what can happen, I guess, is that then naturally people feel kind of defensive potentially about their client or about how they're working with their client. And because there will be reasons, won't there? There will be this the psychodynamic framework again. If the therapist in the room has not picked up certain things that are there, but the group have picked up, then of course there will be reasons why that person hasn't picked them up. So then when the group tries to feed it back to the person, there'll be a part of the person that doesn't want to hear that, understandably. Because if they were already receptive, they would have already picked it up themselves. Almost a tautology. And so inevitably that you're going to be walking a bit of a tightrope, where you're bringing in these people who are apparently third parties, might not be as, you might be just as new as the person who's presenting, or even newer. So there's a skill to teasing those things out, but then also to having the confidence that the group is going to be able to handle whatever might then emerge in the here and now in the room, which again, if you're doing this kind of supervision in a group, which is kind of one person at a time, that's much less likely to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and in that sense, that sort of again leads us to sort of thinking about both the main benefits of being in a group, and the supervision in the way that you say. Well, we could talk about it in both ways indeed, but the main benefits, and also the problems that might be encountered